The smell of smoke and blood had become my perfume. I stood in the corner of the commandeered warehouse in occupied France, my heart hammering against my ribs like a caged bird throwing itself against bars. Around me, chaos, soldiers shouting in German, the sharp crack of gunfire, and somewhere in the distance, the unmistakable sound of advancing Allied forces. This was my moment, the only moment I might get. My name is Eleanor Hartwell, and I was a spy. Not the glamorous kind you read about in novels. I was the desperate kind, the kind born of necessity and rage. 3 years ago, I'd watched the Nazis march into my village outside Lyon, watched them take my father, watched them turn neighbors into informants and friends into ghosts. I'd survived by becoming someone else, someone hollow, someone useful. But usefulness had an expiration date, and mine had just run out. The German officer I'd been assigned to seduce, Major Kessler, with his ice-blue eyes and his collection of stolen paintings, had grown tired of me. Not because I'd failed at my job, I'd been too good at it. I'd given him nothing but empty affection, wrapped in practiced smiles, and somewhere beneath his cruelty he'd sensed the lie. A man like him couldn't tolerate being fooled. Men like him preferred to destroy what they didn't understand. "Find her!" I heard his voice, thick with fury, echoing from the corridor. "The woman is a traitor." My breath caught. They knew. I moved quickly, my fingers trembling as I stripped off the sapphire dress he'd bought me in Paris, the one meant to make me feel like a prize rather than a prisoner. My bare skin prickled in the cold. I'd studied this warehouse for weeks, memorized every corner, every exit, every possibility. The German uniform, hanging on the hook behind the crate in the back room, had been a calculated risk, a gamble that somewhere in the fog of war, one more soldier in grey wool wouldn't raise suspicion. I pulled on the uniform. It hung loose on my frame. I'd lost weight over the years, starved myself partly from stress, partly from rebellion, as if denying myself food was a small act of freedom. My hands shook as I buttoned the tunic. The fabric smelled of sweat and something chemical, something that made my stomach turn. But the fit would work, had to work. My hair was the problem. Long, dark, distinctly feminine. I found scissors in an abandoned desk and hacked it short, not bothering to be neat about it. Pieces fell to the floor like shedding skin. I tied a cloth across my forehead in the style I'd seen the younger soldiers wear. Shadows my face. In the murky light, I might pass. I might. "If you see the woman, shoot on sight." Kessler's voice was closer now, and my stomach dropped like a stone into a well. I stuffed the dress into the crate and grabbed the rifle leaning against the wall. I'd been trained to use one. The British had seen to that before they'd sent me into the lion's den. My fingers found the familiar weight of it, and for a moment I allowed myself to imagine pointing it at Kessler, imagining the justice of a single bullet. But that wasn't my story. That was never going to be my story. I was going to survive. If you're loving Eleanor's escape so far, please hit that like button and subscribe for more stories that will make your heart race. Let's see if you'd have had the courage to do what she did. I moved through the warehouse like a ghost, staying low, keeping to the shadows. The sounds of conflict grew louder. The warehouse was about to become a battleground. British forces were close. I could hear the difference in the gunfire now, the rhythm of their assault. The tide was turning. Germans were running, shouting orders that no longer carried the weight of certainty. I slipped out through a service entrance I'd identified weeks ago, my heart hammering against the German uniform. The streets of the occupied town were chaos incarnate. Soldiers moving in all directions, civilians huddled behind doors and windows, the sky above streaked with smoke. No one looked at me twice. I was just another soldier, unremarkable, invisible. But invisibility wouldn't last forever. I was 3 blocks away, my mind already spinning through the next steps. Find the British lines, give them the intelligence I'd gathered, claim asylum or capture or whatever fate awaited women like me. When I saw him, he was standing at the intersection of 2 narrow streets, rifle raised, eyes sharp and focused. A British captain by the look of him, with dark hair and a face that seemed carved from some mixture of stone and sadness. Our eyes met. "Surrender your weapon," he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man accustomed to being obeyed. His accent was pure, educated English. Now, I could have run. I should have run, but something in those eyes stopped me. A recognition, perhaps, or a question. He was studying me the way a hunter studies a deer that walks upright and speaks. "I'm not your enemy," I said, slowly lowering the rifle, my hands steady despite the trembling in my chest. "Then what are you?" he asked, stepping closer. And that's when he saw it, the slight feminine curve of my shoulder, the delicate angle of my jaw beneath the cloth, the way my hands gripped the rifle with a precision that didn't match the uniform I wore. His eyes widened by a fraction, a shift so subtle most wouldn't have caught it. "You're too beautiful to be the enemy," he said quietly, almost like a confession, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. I didn't know it then, but this moment, this impossible, terrifying, miraculous moment, would change everything. The war would rage on, Europe would burn and bleed and eventually heal. But standing in that intersection, watching this British captain struggle between duty and something else entirely, I understood for the first time that survival might mean more than simply staying alive. It might mean learning to live again. Captain James Sutherland didn't lower his rifle immediately. We stood there, suspended in time, while the sounds of battle echoed around us like an orchestra playing our fear in symphony form. Somewhere, a building collapsed. Somewhere else, a woman screamed. But here, in this narrow street in occupied France, there was only us and the impossible truth written across my face. "What's your name?" he asked finally, his voice soft but edged with command. "Eleanor," I said. "Eleanor Hartwell. I'm British. Or at least, I was. I'm not entirely sure what I am anymore." A flicker of something crossed his expression. Surprise, perhaps, or concern. "How do you come to be wearing a German uniform, Eleanor Hartwell?" "The same way anyone in this war comes to wear anything," I replied, "by necessity and desperation." He studied me for another moment, then lowered his rifle. "We need to move. Now. This sector is about to get very hot." He didn't ask more questions during the evacuation. He simply moved me through the ruins with the efficiency of a man who'd learned to survive in chaos, his hand occasionally at my elbow, guiding me through rubble and blood and the flotsam of a nation at war. British soldiers fell in around us, and if they thought it strange that their captain was escorting a woman in German attire, they kept it to themselves. When you're fighting for your life, questions become a luxury. We moved through checkpoints and defensive positions, and I used the time to observe him. Captain James Sutherland, I learned his full name from a soldier's brief report, was perhaps 35, with the kind of face that suggested he'd seen things that couldn't be unseen. There was a scar along his left temple, thin and white, and his left hand trembled slightly when he thought no one was watching. Shell shock, probably, or something deeper. The war had a way of collecting broken things. By nightfall, we'd reached an improvised British camp hidden in an abandoned chateau outside the town. Soldiers moved between tents and fortified positions, their exhaustion palpable even in their movements. James took me directly to a command tent, where a superior officer, a colonel with iron-grey hair and the expression to match, looked up from a map table. "What do we have here, Sutherland?" the colonel asked, his eyes raking over my German uniform with obvious suspicion. "A potential intelligence asset," James replied carefully. "Found her in German attire, but speaking with a flawless English accent. I believe she's a British operative who's been embedded." The colonel leaned back, skepticism etched into every line of his weathered face. "Is that so? And what makes you certain she's not a German spy planting herself in our midst?" I'd been trained for this. I opened my mouth to give the rehearsed answers, the codes, the verification protocols that would establish my legitimacy. But James spoke first. "Because," he said quietly, "no German would have let herself be vulnerable the way she was. No German spy would have let a British soldier see the fear in her eyes and not try to hide it. The colonel considered this, then nodded slightly. We'll sort it out after we've held this position. Take her to the medical tent, get her cleaned up, and find her proper clothing. I want a full debrief by morning. What followed was surreal. A nurse, a woman named Margaret with kind eyes and calloused hands, bathed away the blood and smoke and accumulated grime of years, gave me clean clothes, and offered me food that I couldn't quite taste. I was running on adrenaline and muscle memory. The part of my brain that had learned to survive was still operating at full speed. The part that knew how to feel anything was locked away, buried under layers of necessary numbness. But then James found me sitting alone in a supply tent, staring at my hands as if they belonged to someone else. "You should rest," he said, sitting down on the crate beside me. He had a bottle of whiskey with him, dark and promising oblivion. "Tomorrow will bring questions, many of them." "I'm used to questions," I replied flatly. "I've been lying professionally for 3 years." "I don't think you were lying," he said. "In that moment we met, I think you were telling the truth for the first time in a very long time." I turned to look at him, and something in his expression unmade me slightly. There was a gentleness there that I wasn't equipped to handle. "Don't do that." "Do what?" "See me." The words came out harder than I intended. "It's easier if you don't see me." He was quiet for a long moment. "I had a sister," he said eventually, "named Catherine. She was captured by the Germans 2 years ago. We found her in a refugee camp, liberated last spring. She'd been used by 3 different officers, moved between positions, treated like—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "She survived, but the surviving woman wasn't the same as the sister I'd known. Do you understand what I'm saying?" "I'm sorry about your sister," I said carefully. "That's not the point," James continued. "The point is that I recognize survival in your eyes. And I need you to know that what you've done, whatever it was, however it was justified, you're not the only one who knows how to become someone else to endure." I took a sip of the whiskey he offered, and it burned like confession down my throat. I seduced a German officer for intelligence. I let him believe I felt something for him. I used my body and my mind as weapons. And when he finally saw through me, I was prepared to put a bullet in his brain if I'd had a clear shot. James didn't flinch. "Did you have a clear shot?" "No," I said. "I ran instead. I'm very good at running." "You're also very good at surviving," he said. "And now you're going to survive this too." That night, I slept in a military cot in a tent that smelled of canvas and earth and distant rain. And for the first time in 3 years, my dreams didn't include screams. Morning came grey and cold, with mist clinging to the valley like a living thing. I was taken to the command tent for the promised debrief, and what I found there was not gentle questioning, but a carefully orchestrated interrogation. The colonel was accompanied by 2 intelligence officers, a man with steel-rimmed glasses and a woman who'd clearly been trained to notice inconsistencies in testimony. They knew who I was. Not Eleanor Hartwell the spy, but Eleanor Hartwell, the daughter of Dr. Edmund Hartwell, the British physician who'd been captured in France and presumed dead. "Your father transmitted intelligence to us for nearly 18 months before communication ceased." The woman officer, Major Helen Winters, sharp-eyed and sharper-minded, began. "We've been unable to locate him since October 1941. What can you tell us about his last known location?" This was the part of my story I'd rehearsed 1,000 times, the pain I'd learned to describe as clinically as possible. My father was in Lyon. He was running a medical clinic that treated both French civilians, and I paused deliberately, German soldiers. It made him useful. It also made him vulnerable. "To whom?" the man with the glasses asked, his pen poised over a notebook. "To ambitious officers who believed they could exploit his medical knowledge for their advantage," I said. "To the SS, who suspected him of passing information to the resistance. To any number of people who wanted what he had and were willing to destroy him to get it. And you. Major Winters leaned forward. How do you come to be alive when so many others with similar profiles have been executed? Because I was smarter, I said flatly, and because I was a woman. Men are often underestimate what women are capable of. I used that. The interrogation lasted 5 hours. They walked through my years of service methodically, testing my knowledge of codes I'd been trained with, locations I claimed to have infiltrated, intelligence I'd supposedly gathered. I was good at this. I'd been trained by some of the best operatives in British intelligence, and I'd spent 3 years proving myself in the field. The inconsistencies they tried to trap me with slid off the polished surface of my rehearsed answers. But when they asked about Major Kessler, something shifted. "He's dead," I said, and the certainty in my voice made the woman officer's eyes narrow. "Killed this morning when the warehouse was bombed. The structural collapse trapped him inside. I'm relatively certain of this fact." "How certain?" the man with glasses asked. "Certain enough to know that his death wasn't quick," I said carefully. "I heard him screaming as the ceiling came down." The silence that followed was vast and uncomfortable. Major Winters exchanged a glance with her colleague, then leaned back in her chair. "You understand that this information cannot be verified." "I understand that many things about war cannot be verified until long after the war is over," I replied. "I understand that you need to decide whether I'm an asset or a liability. I'm prepared to help you make that decision in whatever way you require." The interrogation ended shortly after that, with neither conclusion nor commitment. I was reinstated to temporary quarters, a small room in the chateau with a guard outside, though whether I was being protected or imprisoned remained unclear. James didn't come that day or the next. I was beginning to understand that whatever had passed between us in that moment on the street had been aberration, a break in protocol that his duty would require him to repair. It was on the 3rd day that the message came. A soldier brought a note written in James's precise handwriting. "There's something you need to see. Tonight, 1 hour after dinner, come to the northern archway of the courtyard." Escape, my training whispered. This could be escape. They could have discovered my true operational status, the fact that I was reporting to 2 different British departments who had conflicting interests. They could have learned about the classified information I'd gathered, but not yet transmitted. This could be a trap, and a man with James's training would be exactly the kind of asset they'd use to spring it. But I went anyway, because in 3 years of being useful and hollow and strategically empty, I'd forgotten how it felt to be someone worth saving. And James Sutherland, with his trembling hands and his sad eyes and his impossible gentleness, had somehow managed to remind me. The courtyard was moonlit and empty. Ancient stone arches rose into shadow above me, and somewhere in the distance I could hear soldiers moving through the camp, the ordinary sounds of an army at rest. James appeared from the shadows like a ghost. But when I touched his arm to confirm he was real, he felt solid, real, present. "They want me to leave," I said before he could speak. "There's a transport heading to Marseille tomorrow. They're sending me to a safe house for debrief. After that, they're transferring me to a position in London. I'm to train new operatives." He nodded, unsurprised. "That's good. That's what you deserve." "It's not what I want," I said, and the words came out raw and unbidden. I'd been trained to control every word, to calculate every utterance. 3 years of discipline shattered in a single sentence. James reached out, and his fingers brushed my face with a tenderness that made my breath catch. "Eleanor, I know," I interrupted. "This is impossible. You're military, I'm intelligence. We're operating under completely different chains of command. This violates at least 17 different regulations. I've read them all." "I'm not concerned with regulations," he said quietly. "I'm concerned with the fact that when I close my eyes, I see you standing in a German uniform, and I see the moment you became real again. I'm concerned with the fact that 3 days of not seeing you has been harder than any interrogation I've endured." "Don't," I whispered. "Please don't make this harder." "Then come with me," he said. Leave the transport. Leave the safe house. Leave all of it. We can disappear. Switzerland, perhaps, or Argentina. Somewhere the war hasn't reached yet. Somewhere we could be ordinary. We could be human again. It was the fantasy of someone who'd been broken by the war, someone who didn't yet understand that there was no going back, no returning to the place before everything fractured. But it was also the most dangerous kind of truth. The possibility that someone might actually choose me, not for what I could do or what I represented, but simply because I existed. I can't, I said, though the words nearly destroyed me saying them. And neither can you. You know this. He kissed me then, brief and anguished, tasting of whiskey and regret. Tell me something true, he whispered against my mouth. One thing that's just yours. Something you've never shared with anyone in 3 years. I pulled back, and in the moonlight, I let him see something I'd locked away so carefully. My favorite flower is the iris, I said. My father grew them in our garden before the war. When I was a child, he told me that irises were the flowers that carried messages between the earth and heaven. I used to sit among them and pretend I was invisible. After he was taken, I couldn't look at flowers for a year. Even now, I have to remind myself that beautiful things still exist, even when the world is burning. James's eyes glistened. Thank you, he said, for that, for letting me see you. I left the courtyard knowing I would never see him again. Some choices are made for us by circumstance and duty. Some loves are defined by their impossibility. As I walked back to my quarters through the moonlit night, I allowed myself one moment of grief for the life we might have had in an alternate universe where the war didn't exist, and men like him could have women like me without the world burning around them. The transport to Marseille was a military truck driven by a taciturn sergeant who spoke only when necessary. I sat in the back with 2 other passengers, a British agent recovering from a shoulder wound and a French resistance member whose name I never learned. The roads were damaged but passable, and the journey took 3 days of slow, careful progress through territory that was still contested in places. I thought about James the entire way. This was the part of survival that nobody talked about. Yes, I'd endured interrogation and danger, and the violation of having a man like Kessler believe he possessed me. Yes, I'd learned to compartmentalize trauma and pain and the loss of my father into boxes so deep and dark that sometimes I forgot they were there. But I hadn't anticipated this, the sharp, incisive ache of choosing duty over desire, of walking away from the only genuine moment of connection I'd had in years. The safe house in Marseille was operated by an older woman named Margot, who'd been running intelligence operations since the Spanish Civil War. She had sharp features and sharper judgment, and when I arrived, she took one look at me and understood that I wasn't simply recovering from field deployment. You left someone, she said, not a question. A captain, I admitted. There was nothing to leave. It was impossible. Margot made tea that tasted faintly of lavender and resignation. You're young enough to believe that impossible things should always be put aside for practical concerns. When you're my age, you understand that impossible things are sometimes the only things worth doing. She paused, studying me over the rim of her cup. He sent a letter before you arrived. Standard protocol says I should have burned it, but I didn't. My heart stopped. She handed me an envelope, official military stationery, sealed with wax. My hands shook as I opened it. Eleanor, I've been formally reprimanded for a security breach related to a classified interaction during your debriefing. The reprimand is minor enough that it won't destroy my career, but significant enough that they've reassigned me to a desk position in London. I should be angry about this. Instead, I find myself grateful. Perhaps gratitude is what they're exploiting, sending me to a place where I might imagine running into you by coincidence, where the war feels slightly less real. They're cruel, the people who run these organizations. I want you to know something. You are not defined by what you survived or what you did to survive it. You are not your training or your sacrifices or the lies you've learned to tell perfectly. You are the woman who, in a moment of perfect clarity, trusted a stranger with the truth about irises and invisible gardens. That woman, the one beneath all the survival strategies and operational protocols, is the one worth saving. Should you ever find yourself free of duty, should you ever believe that your life belongs to you and not to the organization that's trained you, I want you to know that I will be waiting. Not in some romantic fantasy of a life we could never have, but in the real world with real limitations and all of the complications that entails. If you decide that's not enough, I'll understand. But I needed you to know that someone sees you. Someone believes you're worth more than your usefulness. If this letter reaches the wrong hands, I will claim I was compromised or acting under duress, but I suspect Margot has more sense than that. I suspect she'll give it to you because she understands that some risks are worth taking. Be well, Eleanor. Be safe. Be free, if you possibly can. J.S. I read the letter 7 times. I memorized it. Then I gave it to Margot and watched her burn it in the fireplace, the paper curling and blackening until nothing remained but ash. Will you go to him? Margot asked. I can't, I said. Not while the war continues, not while there's intelligence to be gathered, positions to maintain, operations to run. People are depending on you, Margot interrupted gently. People are depending on you to be effective. And you're effective because you've convinced yourself that your survival is less important than your utility. The war will end, Eleanor. It always does. And when it does, there will be a reckoning, not by the enemy, but by yourself. You'll have to face what you've become in the service of survival. I left Marseille for London a week later. The operation that intelligence had planned for me was straightforward. Train new recruits in the tactics I'd learned, help develop new protocols for embedded agents, use my experience to make others into effective weapons of espionage. I was excellent at this. I became known as the harshest trainer in the service because I understood that efficiency required stripping away the unnecessary elements of humanity that made people hesitate. Nobody questioned why I was so effective. Nobody asked if it cost me something. But 3 times a week, at exactly the same time, I would leave my apartment and walk through London's devastated neighbourhoods. I never deviated from the route. I never changed the time. I was leaving a trail for James to follow if he chose to. I was committing a security breach that should have gotten me court-martialed if anyone had discovered it. He found me on a Tuesday in late autumn, in a park near Kensington Gardens. He was in civilian clothes, demobbed perhaps or on leave. He looked thinner than I remembered, as though the war had taken more from him than the ordinary toll of survival. You left a trail, he said, sitting beside me on the bench. I wanted you to find me, I admitted. I wanted to know if this was real or just wartime fantasy. And now, he asked. I turned to look at him, this man who'd seen me at my most vulnerable and hadn't looked away. Now I think we both deserve to find out. The war in Europe ended in the spring of 1945. I watched the victory celebrations from my apartment in London, saw soldiers kissing strangers in the streets, heard the bells ringing from churches that hadn't sounded in years. Everyone around me was ecstatic, liberated, dancing toward a future that suddenly seemed possible again. I felt nothing but a curious emptiness, as though the part of me that had learned to celebrate had been surgically removed during the years I'd spent in service. James came to find me that evening. He let himself in with a key I'd given him months earlier, when we'd begun meeting secretly in the safe spaces between duty and desire. He didn't question my silence or my stillness. He simply sat across from me and waited. It's over, I said finally. The war, all of it. We survived. Some of us did, James replied carefully. Others didn't have that option. The bitterness in his voice made me look at him more carefully. He held a newspaper, folded to reveal a headline about German prisoners being processed for trial. His face was harder than I remembered it, carved from something that wasn't quite grief, but wasn't quite anything else either. What's happened? I asked. They found Major Kessler, James said quietly. He's alive. He wasn't killed in the warehouse bombing like you claimed. He was captured by Soviet forces, traded for military intelligence, and is currently in custody, awaiting trial for war crimes. The room tilted slightly. I'd been so certain. I'd heard the screaming, the collapse, the finality of it. But the mind is a tricky instrument, especially when you've been trained to believe what you need to believe. He wants to trade information for leniency, James continued. He's offering details about intelligence operations, embedded agents, people he compromised. Your name is on that list. I'd prepared for this possibility. I'd been trained for it. But preparation is a theoretical exercise, and reality is something else entirely. What will they do with me? Nothing, James said. You're a British agent acting on behalf of the Crown. You're protected by operational immunity. But Kessler is claiming that you seduced him under false pretenses, that you manipulated him into compromising his position. He's trying to reframe his own guilt by claiming victimhood. The irony would have been funny if it wasn't so grotesque. I'd used seduction as a weapon, yes. I'd manipulated a man who was guilty of countless horrors, yes. But the power I'd wielded in that seduction had always been an illusion. A sleight of hand performed by the victimized on their victimizer. Kessler was now claiming that the illusion had been the reality, that the victim had been the predator all along. Let him claim what he wants, I said flatly. He's a war criminal. He'll be tried and executed for what he actually did, not for what he imagines I did to him. He will, James agreed, but the intelligence community is already using his accusations as justification for an internal inquiry. There are people in positions of power who've been waiting for an opportunity to discredit female agents. Kessler has given them exactly what they needed. I stood up abruptly, anger rising through me like fire through dry wood. So what? They bring me in, question me, ultimately conclude that I did my job. I've already been debriefed 3 times about my interactions with Kessler. There's nothing new to investigate. Not if they're looking for facts, James said. But if they're looking for a narrative, if they're searching for evidence that women in the intelligence service are compromised by their own sexuality, a liability rather than an asset, then yes, there's plenty to investigate. This is ridiculous, I said, but I already knew he was right. I'd seen how the men in power looked at female agents. They were useful, exotic even, but ultimately suspect. The war had forced them to recognize female capability. Peace was giving them permission to question it. There's another option, James said carefully. They want me to deliver a message. If you resign from the service quietly, there will be no public inquiry, no trial, no formal investigation. You'll simply disappear. You can reinvent yourself. You can be free. Free? I laughed bitterly. Resigned in disgrace, possibly discredited, with no credentials to explain my absence from the workforce for 5 years. That's not freedom, James. That's exile. I know, he said. I'm sorry. For what? For bringing me this news, or for the fact that the organization we both served is fundamentally corrupt? Both, James admitted. And also because I was hoping that the war ending would mean you could stay. I was hoping we might have a chance at something normal. I studied him for a long moment. He looked exhausted, as though the years of war had finally caught up with him now that he could stop running. His hands were shaking again, the tremor I'd noticed months ago more pronounced. He was breaking, I realized. The war had broken him too, and he was beginning to feel it now. What do you want to do? I asked. I want to leave, he said quietly. I want to take the pension I've earned, the medals they'll give me, and I want to disappear somewhere they can't find me. I want to try to remember who I was before all of this. And I want you to come with me, if you'll have me. Not as a spy, not as an operative, not as anything other than someone trying to rebuild a life that makes sense. It should have been impossible. We barely knew each other outside of the context of war. Our entire relationship had been built on adrenaline and danger and the kind of intimacy that only develops when you're both standing on the edge of an abyss. Any psychologist would have told us that what we felt was trauma bonding, that it wouldn't survive in normal circumstances. But I was tired. I was so deeply, fundamentally tired of being useful, and more importantly, I was tired of being alone. "Where would we go?" I asked. "Switzerland first," James said. "It's neutral, peaceful, and there are established networks for people who need to disappear. After that, wherever we choose. A cottage in the countryside, a small village where nobody asks questions. Maybe Argentina, as I suggested in that moment in the courtyard. Somewhere the war hasn't reached, where we could actually be ordinary." I should have refused. The part of me that had been trained to survive, to calculate risks and mitigate threats, should have rejected this as a security liability. I should have reported James to my superiors for his suggestion that I disappear. I should have done 1,000 things that the operative Eleanor Hartwell would have done. But I was also the woman who loved irises, who had hidden in invisible gardens as a child, who had spent 3 years becoming hollow for the sake of survival. And that woman was still in here somewhere, buried beneath the training and the trauma and the carefully constructed walls. "All right," I said. "I'll come with you." James came toward me then, and I thought he might kiss me, but instead he simply held me. It was the most dangerous thing either of us could do, to trust that the other person was real, that this moment was real, that survival could be transformed into something like living. 2 days before James and I were scheduled to leave, I received a formal summons to appear before a classified inquiry panel. The location was a building in Whitehall that I recognized. I'd been there before, in the early days of my recruitment, when they were determining if I had the capacity to be the kind of weapon they wanted me to be. The room was sparse, institutional, designed to make you feel small. 3 people sat behind a long table. A general I'd never met, a woman from foreign intelligence who'd always viewed female agents with open skepticism, and a man in civilian clothes who I recognized as being connected to counterintelligence operations. "Miss Hartwell," the general began without preamble, "we've received information that you may have discussed classified operational details with Captain James Sutherland, and moreover, that you've been in regular contact with him despite his assignment to a position completely separate from your own. I'd prepared for this. I'd had 48 hours to construct a narrative that wouldn't incriminate James or myself, but would be sufficiently believable to satisfy their inquiry. "Captain Sutherland assisted in my extraction and initial debriefing," I said calmly. "During that time, we developed a professional rapport. It's natural that we maintained contact after the formal debriefing concluded. Nothing classified was discussed." "Is that so?" the woman from Foreign Intelligence asked. "Because we have a report that you were observed in a park with Captain Sutherland on multiple occasions, and that you have been providing him with documents from your work in training operations." "I haven't provided any classified documents," I said. "Captain Sutherland has clearance for training protocols. His reassignment placed him in a position where he needed to understand modern intelligence techniques." "Yet this is curious," the man from counterintelligence interjected, "because Captain Sutherland's position doesn't require that knowledge, and moreover, he's been requesting a discharge from the service, which would eliminate his need for any classified information whatsoever." I'd made a mistake, I realized. They weren't just investigating my interactions with James. They were investigating James. They were building a case against him. "Captain Sutherland is entitled to request discharge," I said carefully. "His service record is exemplary, and if he's decided that military life is no longer compatible with his goals, that's his prerogative." "It is," the general agreed. "However, it becomes curious when discharge requests coincide with allegations of security breaches. We need to know, Miss Hartwell, what exactly is the nature of your relationship with Captain Sutherland." This was the moment. This was the point at which I had to decide whether I was going to protect myself or protect James. The old Eleanor Hartwell, the one who'd survived 3 years of war by being willing to betray anyone and anything, would have thrown him under the bus without hesitation. She would have claimed that James had pressured her, had threatened her, had manipulated her into providing information, but that Eleanor was dead. Or at least I was beginning to understand that she'd been constructed as a temporary measure, a personality designed for a specific war that had now ended. "I'm in love with him," I said flatly, "and he's in love with me. We intend to leave England together. I haven't provided him with any classified information, and I resent the suggestion that my personal relationships are any business of yours. The war is over. I've done everything that was asked of me. I believe I'm entitled to the life I've earned." The 3 panel members exchanged glances that I couldn't quite read. The woman from Foreign Intelligence made a note on the file in front of her. The man from Counterintelligence appeared to be suppressing something. Anger, perhaps, or amusement. "You understand," the general said carefully, "that if you leave the country with Captain Sutherland without proper clearance, you can be charged with espionage and treason?" "I understand that threat," I replied. "I also understand that I'm a British citizen in a time of peace, and that threatening me with criminal charges for the crime of falling in love seems like exactly the kind of abuse of power that we claim to be fighting against." "It's not a threat," the woman said coldly. "It's a statement of legal consequence." "Then I'll take my chances," I said. The interrogation lasted another hour, cycling through the same questions in different configurations, trying to trap me in contradictions or reveal hidden information. I remained calm and consistent. I didn't deviate from my story. I didn't implicate James or myself in any genuine security breach. When it was over, they dismissed me with the kind of look that suggested I'd just made a very dangerous enemy. I found James waiting outside the building. He took one look at my face and understood immediately that something had changed. "We need to move," he said quietly. "Tonight. They're building a case against both of us, but if we're already gone, it becomes significantly more complicated for them to pursue it." "Where?" I asked. "I have contacts," James replied. "People who specialize in helping individuals disappear. We'll be in Switzerland within 48 hours. After that, we vanish completely." The escape happened with terrifying efficiency. James had been planning for this possibility, it seemed, and had already arranged false documents, passage on a fishing vessel, and a safe route through the chaos of post-war Europe. We packed only what we could carry, and that night I walked away from the life I'd built and the person I'd become. As I was leaving my apartment, I found an envelope slipped under my door. Inside was a photograph, James and me in the park, taken from a distance by someone with a telephoto lens. Someone in the intelligence service had been following us all along, documenting our relationship, building their case. But they'd made an error. On the back of the photograph, someone had written, "Run far, run fast, run free. They don't deserve you. M. Margot." The woman who'd taught me about impossible things worth doing had been helping us all along. We made it to the coast just before dawn. The fishing vessel that James's contacts had arranged was small, weathered, and crewed by men who asked no questions. As we pulled away from the English shore, I watched the white cliffs disappear into the distance and understood that I was finally truly free. The woman I had been in service to the war, the hollow, efficient, useful woman, was drowned in that water between England and France. What remained was not yet fully formed, but it was real. It was mine. It was enough. Switzerland in 1945 was a country of contradictions. It had remained neutral throughout the war, which meant that while the rest of Europe was healing from catastrophic wounds, Switzerland was relatively untouched. The mountains were still beautiful, the villages were intact, food was plentiful. To someone who'd spent 5 years in a war zone, it felt like stepping into another reality entirely. Margot had given James the name of a safe house operator in Interlaken, a woman named Suzanne, who ran a small hotel that catered to people who needed to disappear. She asked few questions and accepted payment in gold and gems that James had apparently been acquiring for months in preparation for this possibility. She provided us with new identities. I became Margaret Sutherland, a widow, and James became Edward Sutherland, a businessman recovering from nervous exhaustion. The irony wasn't lost on me. James had once told me that his sister's survival had changed her so fundamentally that she became a different person. Now, standing in a small hotel room in the Swiss mountains, I understood exactly what he meant. The person I had been couldn't survive peace. That version of Eleanor required the constant adrenaline of danger to maintain her existence. "Who am I now?" I asked James one morning, watching the mountains from our window. "I don't have an operational identity anymore. I don't have a mission. I don't have a role that makes sense of my existence." "You're whoever you want to be," James said, but he was looking at me carefully, trying to gauge my mental state. "You're a woman who loves irises. You're a woman who survived impossible things. You're the woman I love. You can be any combination of those things. You can be all of them. You can be none of them and discover new things about yourself." "Ah, that's terrifying," I said. "I know," he replied, "but it's also freedom." We spent the first week simply learning how to be human again. We'd been soldiers, agents, weapons in the service of the state. We'd forgotten, or in my case never really learned, how to exist for any purpose other than utility. James struggled with insomnia and tremors that came without warning. I struggled with hypervigilance, startling at sudden noises, calculating exits and threats before I could even remember where I was. Suzanne, the hotel operator, recognized these symptoms. She was someone who'd spent the war helping resistance members escape, and she understood trauma. She suggested we find a therapist, someone in the town who could help us process what we'd endured. It felt wrong to externalize the trauma that I'd learned to carry internally, but slowly I began to understand that suppression had never really been survival. It had just been a different kind of death, a kind of living burial that required constant maintenance to prevent collapse. The therapy was brutal. The therapist, an older man named Dr. Steiner, who'd himself fled persecution, didn't allow me the comfort of my operational narratives. He made me describe, in explicit detail, what I'd done to survive. He made me examine the justifications I'd constructed. He made me reckon with the cost of being useful. "You believed that your survival depended on your utility," he said during one particularly difficult session. "But survival is inherent. You have value simply by existing, regardless of what you can do or achieve. That's a very difficult thing for people like you to accept, because you've been trained to believe otherwise." "People like me?" I asked. "Trauma survivors who've been trained to transform their trauma into functionality," he clarified. "The military, intelligence services, organizations like that. They've always preferred broken people because broken people understand pain so well that they can inflict it without hesitation. But breaking doesn't permanently install functionality. It simply displaces the pain, and eventually gravity forces it back down." I'd begun to paint during this period. I'd never been artistic before the war, but I found that I could express things through color and form that I couldn't articulate through words. My paintings were dark at first, nightmares given physical form, images of fire and blood and violation. But gradually, as weeks turned into months, the paintings began to lighten. Colors appeared, flowers emerged. 3 months into my recovery, I painted irises, dozens of them, in a garden that existed only in my memory, with my father walking through them in clothes he'd worn before the war, his face distinct in my mind for the first time since his death. I wept while I was painting it, the first true grief I'd allowed myself to feel since I'd learned of his capture. James found me in the small room we'd converted into a studio, surrounded by paintings, tears streaming down my face. He didn't say anything. He simply held me while I cried, because he understood that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is allow yourself to feel. "I think I need to know what happened to him," I said eventually. "To my father. The intelligence service never told me. They said it was unknown, but I think they knew and simply didn't think it was relevant to share." "Do you want me to find out?" James asked. "I don't know," I said honestly. "There's a part of me that believes not knowing is easier. But there's another part of me that understands I'll never be able to truly move forward without closure." It took James 6 weeks, but he found the information through channels he'd cultivated in his years in intelligence. My father had been executed in Lyon in November 1942, 6 months after his capture. He'd been tortured for information, but he'd given them nothing. He'd died with his integrity intact. The knowledge didn't make the loss hurt any less, but it transformed the quality of the pain. It became grief rather than anxiety, finality rather than unknowing. I could mourn him for who he was rather than agonizing about who he might have become. By the summer of 1946, James and I had achieved something that felt dangerously close to peace. We rented a cottage in the mountains, not far from the village, and we began building something that approximated a normal life. James found work as a tutor, teaching English to children in the local school. I began selling my paintings to a gallery in the nearest city, starting with small pieces and gradually working up to larger compositions. Nobody asked where we'd come from. Nobody questioned the false documents that Margot had procured for us. Switzerland had made a career out of not asking questions, and we benefited immensely from that cultural reticence. But peace, I was beginning to understand, wasn't a destination. It was a constant process of choosing to accept your own humanity, to set aside the operational narratives that had kept you alive, to rebuild yourself from whatever fragments remained. Some days I succeeded. Some days I found myself sliding back into hypervigilance, calculating threats that didn't exist, assessing how quickly I could escape any given situation. But increasingly, those moments were becoming the aberration rather than the norm. I was becoming human again, slowly, painfully, authentically. Word came in early 1947 that Major Kessler had been tried and convicted of war crimes. The sentence was execution, scheduled for March. I learned about it from a newspaper article that Suzanne left on our table with a note. "I thought you should know. S." I felt nothing when I read it. Not satisfaction, not revenge, not justice. Simply nothing. The man who'd tried to possess me, who'd manipulated me, who'd represented so much of what I'd survived, his execution meant nothing to my present. He was a ghost, and ghosts have no power over the living. But there was something else in the newspaper, buried in a small article on an interior page. British intelligence had declared me officially dead, killed in action on March 14, 1945. They'd held a memorial service, apparently quite well attended. My former colleagues had said nice things about me. I showed the article to James. He read it carefully, then looked up at me with a slight smile. "You're dead," he observed. "Apparently so," I agreed. "Which means they've stopped looking for us. Which means we're safe." "Are we?" James asked. "Or are we simply free?" It was an important distinction, and not one I'd consciously recognized until he asked it. Safety is something that's provided by external forces, security, reassurance, protection, but freedom is something you claim for yourself, something you choose. I'd been thinking of our escape as safety, as removing ourselves from threat, but it was actually freedom. It was the choice to stop being a weapon and become a person instead. "I think we're free," I said. That spring, we decided to get married. It was a small ceremony in the village church, witnessed by Suzanne and Dr. Steiner and a handful of other people who'd become our community. I wore a dress that Suzanne had helped me choose, pale blue rather than white, and in my hair was a sprig of iris that James had found at a local florist shop. As I walked down the aisle, walked, not processed, walked as an ordinary woman, in an ordinary dress, in an ordinary church, I understood that I had finally, definitively, become someone new. Not Eleanor Hartwell the spy, Not Margaret Sutherland, the widow, but a hybrid of both and neither. A woman who'd survived darkness and learned to love light. A woman who'd been a weapon and had transformed herself into something far more dangerous. A woman who was finally genuinely human. James's vows were simple. He promised to protect me, to love me, to help me heal. I promised him the same, with an additional promise. I promised to stop being useful and start being present. I promised to love you not because it serves a purpose, but simply because you exist. We bought a small farm after the wedding, with land that was suitable for growing flowers. I planted irises the first season, creating a garden that matched the one in my memory. James learned to work the land, and we both learned that there was a profound satisfaction in growing things, in nurturing life rather than destroying it, in creating beauty instead of eliminating threats. But in the winter of 1948, a letter arrived at our address in Switzerland. It had been forwarded multiple times, taking months to reach us. The return address was London, British intelligence, and the envelope was marked with an official seal. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a single page, written in a formal governmental tone, informing me that my official status had been changed from deceased to disappeared, and that I was being offered a full pardon for the security breach that had precipitated my departure. Moreover, I was being offered a new position, intelligence liaison to the United Nations, based in Geneva, a position that would allow me to remain in Switzerland but work for the British government once more. I read it 3 times, then burned it in the fireplace. "They want you back," James said quietly, watching the paper curl and blacken. "Yes," I confirmed, "but I'm not going back." "Are you certain?" he asked. "Because you had a gift, Eleanor. You were brilliant at what you did, and now that the war is over, that gift could be used in ways that don't necessarily require you to compromise your morality or your humanity." "Perhaps," I acknowledged. "But I spent 5 years becoming excellent at the wrong things. I became excellent at seduction and deception and manipulation and violence. Yes, those skills were necessary to survive. But I don't want to be the kind of person who uses skills like that, even in service of a nation I believe in. I want to be the kind of person who builds things instead of destroying them. I want to paint irises instead of assassinating enemies." James nodded, though I could see the conflict in his expression. He was still partly the soldier, still partly the operative. He understood the appeal of utility in a way that I was learning to reject. "I'm glad," he said finally, "but I want you to know that this choice has a cost. Somewhere in the intelligence community, there are people who believe you betrayed them. They'll hold on to that, and if circumstances change, if war comes again, if they need people like us in some future conflict, they might come looking." "Let them look," I said. "I'll be here in my garden growing irises. Let them explain to the United Nations why they're kidnapping a woman who's officially dead for a position she officially never held." But James was right that there was a cost to refusing. Over the following years, I became aware of subtle pressures. Swiss officials would occasionally inquire about our immigration status. Bank transactions would sometimes be delayed for unexplained reasons. It wasn't persecution, not exactly, but it was a reminder that nowhere is truly neutral, and that freedom purchased by deception is always contingent. In 1950, when I learned that Suzanne had died, she'd had a heart attack in her sleep, peacefully and without warning, I understood that we needed to move again, not because of immediate danger, but because the network that had sustained us was being dismantled by time and circumstance. James and I packed what we could and traveled to Argentina, where the geography was vast enough to swallow 2 people completely, and where the government had proven willing to overlook certain details in the backgrounds of European immigrants. We settled in a small town in Mendoza province, where the wine country reminded me of the French vineyards I'd loved before the war. We rented land, and I created a new garden. James found work in the local school, teaching languages to children who had no idea that their teacher was a highly trained military operative. Our life was quiet. It was safe. It was everything I'd learned to want during my recovery in Switzerland. But it was also incomplete, I realized, because I'd never truly confronted the person who'd broken me most severely. Major Kessler was dead, executed for his crimes. But there was still the matter of the intelligence services that had trained me, broken me, used me, and then tried to discredit me. They'd never faced reckoning for what they'd done to women like me. And I was beginning to understand that my silence, my disappearance, was a form of complicity with that system. The letter came in 1955, forwarded through a series of mail drops and intermediaries that James's old contacts still maintained. It was from a law firm in London, representing a woman named Caroline Ashford, who was organising a class action suit against British intelligence for workplace discrimination and abuse. Caroline had been an operative, like me. She'd been captured, tortured, and then, when she was finally freed, discredited and fired for suggesting that her abuse had compromised her ability to do her job. She was suing for damages, back pay and damages, and she was looking for other female operatives who'd had similar experiences. "You don't have to do this," James said, reading the letter over my shoulder. "We left that life behind. We found peace. You don't owe them anything." "I know," I said, "but I owe it to the women who come after us. The intelligence services are already training new operatives. There will be more women. And if the law doesn't establish that what was done to us was wrong, there will be no incentive to change the system." "It could expose you," James warned. "It could destroy the life we've built." "Yes," I agreed. "But I think I've discovered something over the past 10 years. A life built on hiding isn't actually a life worth living. It's existence, but it's not authentic being." I wrote to Caroline Ashford and agreed to provide testimony. It was terrifying, putting myself back into contact with the system I'd fled, admitting publicly to the things I'd done under its direction, exposing the traumas I'd been trained to suppress. But when the case finally went to trial in 1957, when I sat in a witness box in a London courtroom and described in detail what had been done to me and what I'd been forced to do, I felt something shift. The magistrate was unsympathetic. These were men of the establishment, after all, and the establishment doesn't appreciate women who challenge their authority. But the press covered the trial extensively, and British public opinion had shifted since 1945. The women who'd been hidden away during the war, who'd been instrumental to victory but erased from the narrative afterward, were beginning to demand recognition. We didn't win. The court found that intelligence operatives accepted certain risks and had limited recourse for work-related trauma. But we did win something: visibility. The trial revealed that the intelligence services had a systematic pattern of discrediting female operatives when they became inconvenient, and public pressure forced a minor investigation. Nothing changed fundamentally. Institutions are slow to transform, and powerful systems resist reform. But somewhere in a file in a government building, a note was added to my file. Eleanor Hartwell, deceased, missing, presumed refugee, gave testimony regarding systemic abuses in intelligence services training and deployment, March 1957. After the trial, James and I stayed in London for a month. I visited the places I'd known before the war, walked through Kensington Gardens where I'd met James in peace, stood in front of the intelligence service building where I'd been trained. A woman passed me on the street, young, perhaps 20, with the kind of careful bearing that suggested she might be intelligence service herself. I stopped her. "Are you with the service?" I asked quietly. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, but she didn't walk away. "If you are," I said, "I want to tell you something. They'll train you to believe that your value is measured by your utility. They'll teach you to separate yourself from your emotions, to weaponize your femininity, to accept abuse as the price of your competence. Don't believe them. You are worth more than your usefulness. You deserve a life that isn't contingent on your ability to be dangerous." The young woman looked at me for a long moment, and I saw recognition flicker across her face. She was either a new recruit, in which case she would learn to ignore my advice, or she was an operative who'd already discovered the truth of what I was saying. "Thank you," she said finally, and walked away. When I returned to Argentina, to my garden, and my husband and my quiet life, I felt something I hadn't felt since before the war: peace, without compromise. I'd faced the system that had broken me. I'd testified to my own abuse. I'd refused to remain hidden. And though nothing had fundamentally changed in the machinery of power, I had changed. I'd reclaimed my narrative. I'd proven that I could survive not by being useful, but by being honest. James held me the night we returned home, understanding without being told that something had shifted in me. "You're free now," he said, "really free." "We both are," I replied. And in the garden that we'd planted together, in a country far removed from the battlefields where we'd learned to survive, the irises bloomed. They carried no messages between earth and heaven anymore, as my father had once told me. They simply bloomed because that's what flowers do. They existed for their own beauty, for no purpose beyond their own being. I learned, finally, to be like them. If Eleanor and James's journey touched your heart, please hit like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments. Would you have had the courage to testify against the system, or would you have stayed hidden? I'd love to hear your thoughts on this powerful story of survival and redemption.